Welcome to the AT Parenting Survival Podcast, where you get help and guidance through the chaos of parenting a child with anxiety or OCD. This show is for educational purposes and is not intended to replace the guidance of a qualified professional. Here's your host, child therapist, Natasha Daniels.
Well, hello there, and welcome to another episode of the AT Parenting Survival Podcast. Today, I'm going to be talking about something that so many of us struggle with, and that is the school avoidance, school refusal that kids with anxiety and OCD often have. And we call it school refusal, but I actually see it as school avoidance because I don't think our kids want to refuse school. I think anxiety and OCD just makes it so overwhelming that it becomes this battleground that becomes a huge issue. Because when we can't get our kids to do some basic things like get an education, we get into crisis mode really quickly. So we're going to dive into where do you go with that? What are some concrete steps to take? And what are some pitfalls? Because there are a lot of pitfalls that happen around dealing with this issue. But before we get started, I do want to thank NoCD for sponsoring this episode. NoCD offers affordable, effective, convenient therapy, and they're luckily available in the US and outside the US. You can schedule a free 15-minute consultation to see if NoCD is the right fit for you and your child. Just go to treatmyocd.com. That is treatmyocd.com. I'll also leave a link in the show notes. I also want to let you know that I have a therapeutic OCD card deck. And so if you have kids that are struggling and they need to build those OCD skills, it's a muscle and it has to be worked out every day. And just surviving OCD is not working on that muscle. That's just survival. And that is why I created the OCD card deck, which is kind of like a deck of cards, it's a bit bigger. And your kids just pull a card each day and they work on an OCD skill. I know a lot of us struggle with how do we maintain their skill building on a daily basis. And it becomes kind of burdensome of like, what exposure should I do? Or what should we talk about? And I created this deck so that you don't really have to think about it. You just hand them the deck, pick randomly a card and do what's on the card. And I took my 2 decades of clinical experience working with kids with OCD, and I made 4 categories in this card deck to target 4 specific areas, which include obviously ERP, exposure response prevention. How do we do actions that are exposures? So that's the category, an obvious category. But there's other categories that I think sometimes are missed in OCD skills. The second one is motivation. Let's explore and discuss your motivation level. The third one is your support network. How do you interact with your family and your loved ones? How are you asking them to feed your OCD or not feed your OCD? Bringing that awareness to them. And the fourth one, which is often the most missed, is their self-worth, their self-esteem. OCD takes a hit and it ruins kids' self-esteem. And so we talk about celebrating themselves and seeing their skills and their strengths outside of OCD, and even their work with OCD, and recognizing the power in their struggle and how they're showing up for it, or even starting to show up for it. So you can check out my OCD card deck at my store at natashadanielsco.com. I'll leave a link in the show notes as well. All right, let's jump into today's topic. I want to first start with some common mistakes, because these are the things I see over and over again in my community, my online community, at the AT Parenting community, where I help parents in depth and give them support. It's what I saw in my practice for 2 decades when I was working with families who were dealing with this. And it's even what I've seen in my own home. And I've dealt with this as well on a personal level. So here are 2 of the biggest mistakes. 1, you are putting a Band-Aid on the symptoms and you're not addressing the core fear. So there's no effort on exploring why they're having a hard time going to school. What is the core fear? What is the trigger? What is fueling this? A lot of times people go right into solution mode, which I totally understand that, because it feels like, and it is, a crisis. but it's kind of like running into the sea or into a pool to save someone who's drowning without really kind of assessing the dangers and looking at what's actually going on. So we're going to talk about that today. We're going to talk about how do you figure that out? Because a lot of times I'll say, especially to parents in the AT parenting community who get my in-depth support, I'll say things like, what's the hardest part about them going to school? Or what's the core fear around that? And often, not always, because these are really educated parents once they've been in my community for a few months, but often, especially if they're newer, they'll say things like, I don't know. He just doesn't want to go. How do I get him to go? And that question, how do I get him to go, is premature because we haven't done any of the footwork of understanding and assessing the situation. What's causing it? And people will say, well, it's anxiety or it's OCD. That's not the answer because every kid with anxiety and OCD is different. And until you have a really good understanding of what is the barrier, the really solid concrete wall between home and school, you won't make progress. And people do all sorts of things. They incentivize their kids and they try to bribe them. And we're going to talk about incentivizing later because there's nothing wrong with that. I don't see it as a bribe. But when you're not addressing the undercurrent of what is fueling the school avoidance, it is just bribing. You're not offering skills. You're not tackling the true issues. You're just, let me bribe them to go to school. You can work with the school system and you can develop all sorts of accommodations to get them there. You know, you're going to go to the office or we're going to get you here, but still not addressing the thing that's making them anxious to go there to begin with. So that's a very common mistake. The second common mistake is forcing kids to take big steps. So if I have a child who is literally in their bedroom and can't leave their bedroom, and I'm trying to get them to go to school, but they can't even go to the kitchen to eat. They can't leave their bedroom. The goal of, I want you to go to school full time is a bit of a stretch, right? Because I can't even get them into the kitchen. I can't even get them dressed for the day. So when we're enticing them and saying, like, you need to get up and go to school, and they can't even get up and get dressed and go to the kitchen, the goal is too big. People don't take baby steps a lot of times. They see the end goal because we're all under pressure as parents. And I totally get this from my own private experience, that you get this pressure from the school of, I know it with my son when he was having struggles, it was, the threat of like a truancy officer, we're going to have to report this to the court. And you're like, what? Like, you all of a sudden feel like the whole school system's against you. And there's this pressure, whether it's from the school system or your own internal pressure of, my child is just failure to thrive, like they're failure to function. They're not participating in society anymore. This is getting serious, and it can feel so scary and overwhelming that your main goal is just to get them back to school, which is 100% understandable, but it's not going to happen like that, especially if you have a child or teen who is literally unable to leave their room. I'm just using that as an extreme example because I've heard those things and the goal is too big. Now, your goal might also be too big. You might be saying, I want them to go to school full time, and they haven't been to school full time in like 6 months. And, sometimes they can go for an hour or two and then they call you or you have to pick them up. And then a lot of times they don't go. So the goal of full-time school, that's unreasonable too, because they're failing at it. And the ultimate goal is to give them hope, to give them tools, to give them skills, and to make them feel empowered. And we're only one part of that puzzle. For most of us, we're not going to pick up our children and dump them at school kicking and screaming. A lot of us have older kids where that physically would be impossible, but I wouldn't advise it anyway, because at the end of the day, they're going to be in fight, flight, or freeze mode, and going back to school the next day is going to be even harder. So we're only one part of this puzzle. The other part is our kids. And I think that's the hardest part with anxiety and OCD is, how do I help them to help themselves? Because you can't help them directly. This is stuff that's going on in their head. This is their own anxiety, their own fears, their own OCD. And all you can do is give them the tools and the compassion and the push, right? A compassionate push, but not over the cliff. And they have to do the rest. And sometimes they're not ready to do the rest. And that's really, really hard to accept as a parent, because sometimes parents will say, well, you're asking me to accept that they don't go to school. And it's not asking you to accept that. It's just asking you to acknowledge the actual current reality of what is happening, whether you like it or not, whether you accept it or not. That's the reality. If you have a child who hasn't gone to school in 4, 5, 6 months, that's the reality. And how do you get them back? You can't physically manhandle them and get them back. And so it's frustrating as a parent, because we're paralyzed with fear and wanting the best for our kids, and only they can really move the dial. So how do we do that? We're going to talk about it. The first step is definitely identifying the why. Why is there school avoidance? And I think exploring that is really, really important. I actually have a free PDF on how to get to the core fear. It's a PDF for anybody, like any issue. If you're trying to find the core fear of their anxiety or trying to find the core fear of their OCD, it would help anything. But there's language in there that I talk about in this PDF. I'm trying to find it for you because I have it written down somewhere. If you go to natashadaniels.com/core fear PDF, not hard to remember, natashadaniels.com/core fear PDF, I'll email it to you. And I think that could be a really helpful thing to supplement this episode, because understanding how to ask them the right questions is going to be really key. I talk in the PDF about asking questions like, what is the hardest part of? And I go in depth. It's a pretty in-depth PDF, so you'll get more guidance through that. But we want to ask them things like, what's the hardest part about going to school? And they might say everything. I hate it. Don't make me go. And you want to validate it. I know. I totally get that it's overwhelming for you. And I'm just trying to help understand how I can help you and how we can figure out what's going on. And so these are the kind of weird questions I like to ask kids. I'll say things like, if you could get rid of one part of school, or if they're in middle school or high school and they have periods, I would say, if you can get rid of one period, what would it be? There's meat and data in that. I've had kids that I've worked with in my practice where they didn't want to go to school, and there was a full stop on school, and their heels were dug into the sand. But when we started to explore this, a lot of times it was one specific class or one specific teacher or one specific part of the day that was triggering. It's not always all of school. But kids will throw the baby out with the bathwater, and it will just be, I just can't go. I'm not going to school, when it might be one particular thing. I have seen, we'll actually get into it when I start to list all the different reasons why kids often want to avoid school. I'll give you kind of a common top list of different reasons why. But we want to explore that. Other questions that I ask are things like, if you could change one thing about school, what would it be? Imagine you had a magic wand and you can change literally anything, the rules, the people, whatever. How would you design your school? What it would look like? Now, you might get throwaway answers like, I would trash it. I would burn it. I would say no more school. And I'd say, I totally get that. I understand that's how you feel. That's valid. But let's say you can't get rid of school completely. You can only get rid of parts of school. What would it be? So part of this is the nuanced ability to question, to validate their what I call throwaway answers. Throwaway answers are just general defensive answers. I don't know, everything, whatever. Those are kind of like shut down responses. You don't want to push too hard that you shut down communication. So this might be many, many conversations that you're having, because you have to get in and you have to get out. Once you start reading those nonverbal cues and sometimes verbal cues that they're not wanting to talk about this anymore, you got to get out. Ideally, you got to get out before they're verbalizing that they don't want to talk anymore. Because when they start to say, I don't want to talk about this, you've already gone too far. So get in and get out. And the PDF will go in much more detail about how to find the core fear. And that'll actually benefit you in many other ways as well, because we want to find the core fear in all of their anxiety and OCD themes. The next step is understanding, is it school in particular, or is it anxiety or OCD? Just because our kids have anxiety or OCD doesn't mean that they may not have a legitimate school issue. It's a school problem. Now, a lot of times it's going to be anxiety and OCD showing up in the school environment. We're going to talk about that next. But I first want to say, let's rule out school issues. I see this happening in both ways, where all too often we go right to anxiety and OCD, and we negate the possibility that there could be a school issue because we see everything through the lens of anxiety and OCD. That's fair. That's our world. And so we might not assume that there could be actually a legitimate school issue. And sometimes our kids are sensitive and they have school issues because they're extra sensitive. The other, though, is I often see parents, this happens more often than not, is that it's the other way around, where we think, what's wrong with school? Are they being hurt? Are they being abused? Are they being bullied? We see like what's going on in the school environment, and we don't realize it's just a manifestation of their anxiety and OCD in the school environment. And once it's not school, it'll be college if they go to college. And once it's not college, it will be their employment. It will always be something that they have to do outside of the house. So we're going to get into that in a second. So let's talk about what those school things can be. Well, bullying, I mentioned that just a second ago, definitely bullying. Bullying can happen, especially to our sensitive kids, our neurodivergent kids, our kids with anxiety and OCD. They are often targets of bullying because they're struggling or they're quiet or, there's all sorts of reasons. So bullying is one of them. We want to acknowledge. And if they're feeling like they're being bullied, but you don't think objectively it's bullying, well, that's your opinion. How they feel is the only reality. So our job isn't to say, well, kids will be kids and devalue their experience of feeling bullied. If you feel bullied, you're being bullied because that's your perception. The next one, and these are totally random and not connected at all, although kids can have multiple ones, is overstimulation. And so we might have kids who are overstimulated. They might have other co-occurring struggles like ADHD or autism, and the sound and the crowds and the smells and the fluorescent lights and the buzzing, it's all too much. It's just so much that they can't focus on their academics because they're overstimulated and they're overwhelmed. The next one is peer pressure. And so they might feel overwhelmed by the need to, and this could look different for each kid, maybe fit in or be in that group or, stay on top of things or, the fear of missing out. And so this intense peer pressure, depending on who they're hanging out with socially. Like, so for my daughter, like her peer pressure, thankfully actually, is academic. She is friends with a bunch of really smart kids. And so her peer pressure tends to be around getting the perfect grades and making sure she seems as smart as the rest of the kids that she hangs out with. I'll take that any day, but that comes with a cost too, as far as feeling like the need to be perfect and get those perfect grades. They might have issues with teachers. There are actually some really horrific teachers out there. There are fantastic teachers too. Before you email me and say, I'm a teacher, there are fantastic teachers. And I remember having some amazing teachers, like I still remember to this day. But my kids have had some bad apples and some really inappropriate teachers who are scary or yell at the kids or very aggressive or gossip and talk about other kids or shame kids. My daughter had a teacher that would shame anybody with a 504 plan or a diagnosis. And she would kind of diagnose them as well. She'd say, are you sure you don't have autism? Or she would say things like, is that your ADHD acting up? And my daughter didn't even have ADHD. And so she'd come home and she'd be like, Mom, do I have ADHD? And I'm like, oh my gosh. And the school did nothing about this teacher. She's still there. So that's a school issue. I did go to the school and I tried to advocate, but you can only do what you can do, right? That's still an issue there. And they might have academic stress. So they might have perfectionism or peer pressure, like I talked about with my daughter, where the stress of reaching a bar, whether that is their own bar academically, the bar of the teacher, because we have some people pleasers where really sometimes we look at perfectionism, that's a whole nother episode, and we see just perfect, like they want to be perfect, but we don't understand the core fear behind that as well. And you can have perfectionism because you want to not disappoint your teacher, not disappoint your parent, not disappoint your peers. And you can have perfectionism that's internal, like I'm not good enough unless I'm perfect for me. So we have to look at those different core fears. Again, that PDF will really help. What was it? natashadaniels.com/core fear PDF. I think that was a pretty easy link. All right, so those are the school issues. We're going to separate these out because you're going to handle these differently. Now let's talk about when it's anxiety or OCD. Now, the other issues that I was talking about can be there because partly of their anxiety and OCD. So you can have issues with your teacher because you're super sensitive and teachers feel rough, or they're yelling at the class and you're personalizing it. So you can have that. And you can have academic stress because you're a perfectionist and you're worried. But when I'm talking about it being a school issue, it's primarily in the school environment, caused by the school environment. Now let's talk about anxiety and OCD. Here are a few, not an exhaustive list, of things around anxiety and OCD that are very, very common for school avoidance. These are like the top, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, the top 6 that I can think of just in my practice and in the AT parenting community. These are the ones that come up over and over again. It could be other things, but these are the super common ones. First one, most popular one, social anxiety. You know, that fear of judgment. You're in a fishbowl at school. It's hard. And speaking from my own social anxiety issues, school was the hardest chapter of my life by far. It was like going into a shark tank every day. And so that's not about school. That's about your social anxiety. And as I grew up and went to college and then had, other situations, like had to go to work and also had to, go to my kids' school functions and live in a neighborhood, my social anxiety showed up in all those environments too. It wasn't about school. It just was triggered at school. The next one is perfectionism. So I do have that as a separate category, but that's when it's prevalent in all areas of their life. And so I have perfectionism in lots of things, not just my academic schoolwork, but I have perfectionism in how I look or how I show up or what I do or in different areas. The third one is separation anxiety. That is a huge one for school avoidance because the biggest separation is going to school. But and normally you have issues with going to bed, sleeping in their own bed, or going to people's houses. Sometimes I'll talk to parents and I'll say, is it separation anxiety? No, they're fine separating. When are they separated? Well, there's a few, there's just a few friends that they're willing to go over. And I'm like, well, can you drop them off at, so-and-so's house? No, they're uncomfortable with that. And well, as long as I stay for practice, then they're fine. Not seeing that, those are all signs of separation anxiety. So separation anxiety could be one of them. Another one that's super, super common with school avoidance is emetophobia, the fear of throwing up. I would say hands down, emetophobia and social anxiety are the two most common reasons why kids have school avoidance. Not the only reasons, but those are the two biggest, along with panic attacks and anxiety attacks. Those are big too. Emetophobia, the fear of throw up, so consumed with, if I go to school, I might pick up some germs or I might see someone throw up. I'm kind of trapped at school. I might throw up and I'm really worried. I feel nauseous. I can't go to school. I feel sick. Very, very common. Panic attacks and anxiety attacks, those are common too, because those lead to agoraphobia, the fear of leaving the house. And so, of course, that impacts school because if I'm worried about having a panic attack, and I had panic attacks in my first couple of years at college, and the fear is I just don't want to have a panic attack in front of other people or in public. And as long as I'm home, I feel safer. And so school becomes a byproduct of that avoidance. Anxiety attacks, and that sometimes anxiety attacks go with emetophobia. I'm really worried, what if I get sick and then I feel really anxious, or I have anxiety attack at school, I won't know how to handle it. I need to be near my mom. Those are all reasons why kids don't want to go to school. Some other ones involving OCD, I've seen moral OCD be a big one where, kids are saying bad words or they're doing bad things and I don't want to sit near people who are bad or do bad things, and very triggering for the moral OCD. And then the last one, and a huge one as well, is contamination OCD. OCD doesn't like places where they think it's very germy, and school is very germy. And I think that's probably the number one reason for OCD is contamination and emetophobia. Two separate ones, sometimes overlapping because you can have both, but the fear of being exposed to all those germs in the school environment. So many kids with OCD have school as ground zero, meaning like that's the epicenter of their contamination. And so anything school related is contaminated, and they don't want to bring, their backpack inside. They don't want to bring their clothes that they wore to school. Like, it's all contaminated. So school becomes a big avoidance. The thing is, you get rid of school, and that doesn't get rid of the contamination OCD. Or you get rid of school, it doesn't get rid of the moral OCD. You get rid of school, it doesn't get rid of separation anxiety. You get rid of school, it doesn't get rid of the perfectionism if it's deeper. You get rid of school, it doesn't impact social anxiety. In fact, social anxiety gets worse. And I can tell you from my own personal experience with my child that those things get worse when you remove them from the school environment. But sometimes you have to, and sometimes you don't. We're going to talk after the break about where do you go from here. Stay tuned. That's what's up next.
It's time we put help directly in our kids' hands. Introducing Crushing OCD course for kids and teens.
It was way more helpful than all the other therapy we've ever done because we didn't really know what to do. So we weren't really doing it before. So the course helped to figure out what the exposures are and how to do them.
We're not in therapy and find it really hard to find an ERP trained therapist here. So we're currently with like the public health service, but again, they don't seem to be trained in ERP. It's filled that gap that we don't have that was desperately needed.
This was really well timed for us to use between therapists and to help us get off to a good start with this new practice.
It was easy to use. I was able to do it from my phone or also on the computer.
There's different ages, so there were younger kids, there were teenagers, and so that was really nice to have a variety of ages where it wasn't just geared towards younger kids or older kids. It was a nice variety.
It's helpful for our kids to hear it from this third party as opposed to just us saying it.
I really like the offense and defense method. I love working on poking at OCD while it's sleeping. It makes it a little bit easier to do, and it's kind of fun. I'm planning on using it to work on my fear of holding or touching batteries and stuff like that.
So it was really helpful, and I think a lot of other kids would like it. I thought that I was the only one who had worrying about the weather and stuff. And then there was somebody else on there who worried about the same thing, which was really helpful.
Seems less scary to work on stuff now that I've watched this class, and I'm more interested to work on it.
I like trying to do more exposures still, and before I wasn't, I just didn't want to do them.
I've worked on some of my bigger compulsions and been successful.
I realized that it was helpful to do the exposures. Before it was really, really hard. It's still hard, but it's helpful to know that I need to do them.
Before there would be a lot of battles about it, so it is definitely less loggerheads.
Really, really good course and super helpful.
Definitely would recommend this. It's really easy to follow. It's nice bite-sized videos. I really like the worksheets that go along with it, and I think it's really helpful.
To learn more about this course and register your child or teen, go to atparentingsurvivalschool.com.
Welcome back. Okay, so we broke things down into school issues versus anxiety and OCD. When it comes to school issues, one of your first things might be to rectify it with the school. If you're dealing with bullying and you feel like it can be rectified, then maybe you want to go to the school administration and talk about, can you get them out of that particular class, or can you cocoon them in some way? And we're going to get to when things are too acute in a second, even if it's the school environment or anxiety and OCD. We'll talk about that in a second, but we're talking about things that can be rectified. Overstimulation, are there things that you can do to, put in accommodations to help them feel less overstimulated? Could they eat somewhere else? Could they wear vibes in their ears that filter out loud sounds? Can they have a quiet place to do testing, right? So when we're looking at school issues, these are possible ways that we can get accommodations in the school environment. In America, that might require a 504 plan. You can have a very bright, gifted child. Obviously can't get an IEP because it's not academic, But a 504 plan, you can get straight A's and still get a 504 plan to get accommodations for these mental health issues. If it's peer pressure, that might be something they can process in therapy of how do you navigate and handle peer pressure. If it's an issue with a teacher, can they be removed from that class? That's not avoidance in a negative way. It's making their learning environment optimal so that they don't have to feel this extra stress while they're trying to learn. Academic stress, again, that might be a 504 plan. Can they have reduced homework? Can they have reduced assignments? There's a lot of wiggle room when it comes to it being a school issue. And there comes a time when if it's a school issue and the brick and mortar school structure isn't working for your child, it might mean that you're going to have to look for an alternative educational methodology because the brick and mortar school is not working for your child. And we're going to talk about that in a second. When it comes to anxiety and OCD, there are still some wiggle room to work with accommodations. The important thing to understand with anxiety and OCD is that it's not the school. It is the disorder. It's the disorder showing up at school. But if it wasn't school, it would be a different environment. And so you can start with accommodations with social anxiety, maybe not having a teacher call on them, or maybe they don't have to present in front of the class. Maybe they can present afterwards. These to me are helpful accommodations. They're not feeding the anxiety or OCD. I feel like the number one goal is to get our kids the academic success that they deserve and need at whatever cost. And so the front burner issue when it comes to academics is getting them to be able to go to school and get an education. And if that means that we have to accommodate some of their anxiety or OCD, long-term or short-term, I think that is okay because that's not the environment to push the envelope because they already have a lot on their plate when they're going to school. School's already hard with academics and peers and the environment that we're just trying to set them up for success. So if we need to have accommodations that say, hey, teacher, you can't call on them randomly, that might be something that we need to do. If they are dealing with separation anxiety, it might be, is there a go-to person at school that can feel kind of like mom so that when they're feeling anxious, they can go to that person? If it's emetophobia, is there a plan that if they feel triggered, that they can go to the office or the library and have a safe place to sit? Or if they are feeling nauseous, that they can go to the nurse and the plan is that then they go back to class and maybe they have a pass that can get them out of class whenever they need it. When you come up with these plans, I mean, I had worked with a child who had emetophobia and was like very strong school refusal. But then when we figured it out that they felt trapped and we were able to move their seat near the door for every class, and they were able to get a pass where they can go to the library or the office if they felt triggered, like someone was going to be sick or someone was sick, because it did happen quite a lot. That helped them go to school and feel safe while they worked on their emetophobia in therapy and at home. And so there are things that we can do once we know where is the trigger and what is happening. Can we develop some way to accommodate their environment in a way that makes them feel safe? With my daughter, when she had emetophobia and sensory motor OCD, where she had to go to the bathroom 1 million times an hour, she had a 504 plan and she was able to eat. She didn't want to eat in the cafeteria because she would feel nauseous and then she thought she was going to throw up. We did find out later that she had celiac. So she was feeling nauseous more than for just anxiety. She was feeling nauseous because she was obviously eating food at the time that we didn't know was making her feel sick. But it evolved into a full-blown emetophobia, which she still sometimes struggles with because she does have a medical issue that makes her nauseous, but then her anxiety gets hooked into that and then it overwhelms her. But we had accommodations that initially she ate in the nurse's office, and then eventually she ate in another classroom that wasn't her peers, and then eventually we got her back to the cafeteria. And so there were small steps that we were able to do to get her back once we realized that going to the cafeteria was why she didn't want to go to school. It was why she would melt down in the mornings. It was why she wanted to avoid. But then when we accommodated that, it was also she didn't want PE and she didn't want recess, all the times where she thought she would feel nauseous. So you have to be aware that these things can grow. And the more we accommodate, sometimes the more they grow. And so we didn't say, okay, you don't have to go to recess and you don't have to go to PE. we said that's kind of where we're going to stop with the accommodations and slowly moving her back to the cafeteria. If she needed to stay and eat in a quiet space for the rest of her life, I would be okay with that. We just weren't going to go down that slippery slope of now her anxiety and OCD were demanding more accommodations and more. And that's why you have to be careful about the slippery slope. But looking at those things, if my child has contamination OCD and I ask them, where do you feel the most contaminated at school? What's your biggest struggle? Maybe they say, I really have a hard time going to the bathroom. That's a common one for social anxiety and contamination OCD. And for moral OCD, depending if they're in high school and that's where kids are smoking and doing, quote unquote bad stuff, then that's triggering too. I actually had a girl who was afraid of going to the bathroom in high school. And we arranged it with the high school that she can go into the guidance counselor and she can use their bathroom without anyone questioning her. And then school wasn't as much of a problem anymore because that particular issue was resolved. It is amazing when you really dig and you find the specifics that you can adapt. I once had a boy who was younger and he had to share all of his school supplies. And, they had like a bucket of crayons and they had a bucket of scissors, and it was overwhelming for this little kid. And we weren't there yet in therapy as far as exposing him and doing exposures. And so the accommodation was he gets his own school supplies and he has his own little bucket and he brings them and nobody touches them. Well, that helped immensely just get him back to school while we worked on the issue. So that's where the core fear and understanding how the themes are showing up in the school environment can really, really help. There are times though where it's a bridge too far. And you have to gauge that as a parent. When is it too far? So when we go back to the school being, the brick and mortar school not being an ideal setting for your child's academic success, that's not a perfect environment for everybody. Some kids, especially autistic kids or overly sensitive kids or overly stimulated kids, are not going to learn in that environment. There's too many other moving pieces that are overwhelming. Sensory overload, the constant swarm of people, learning in a group of 30 or 40 kids, it's too much. And so if that is the case, then it might be that an alternative ideally is a better situation because we want them to thrive. And so that might be like looking for a smaller school environment. It might mean looking for an alternative school environment like an online school or a home school. Depending on where you live, you have to look at your options. Some places have more options than others. In Arizona, I feel like we were really fortunate that there are a lot of options. There are charter schools, there are private schools, there are online schools, there's homeschooling, there's hybrid programs where it's part online and part in person. So a lot of options. I know not all of you have a lot of options, but I didn't even think I had a lot of options until I started really digging. I thought my options were pretty bad until I started to dig and found a really good option for my son. But you want to say, and you maybe ask your child, what would it look like if you had this learning environment? Or, if you did the online schooling or this charter school where, there's like 10 kids in a class. So that is the first step, is really realizing that not every school is a perfect fit for every child. So that's the first thing I would look at if we're talking about school issues. But then when we're talking about anxiety and OCD issues, that's a hard call because they're going to take their social anxiety, their perfectionism, their separation anxiety, their emetophobia, their moral OCD, their contamination OCD, their whatever, their panic attacks. They're going to take that with them wherever they go. And if we go online or homeschool, they're going to get very used to not facing challenges. And they're going to get into a very cocooned, comfortable bubble. And it will make it harder for them to reintegrate back into that type of situation when they have a work situation. What I've seen with a lot of kids is they become a bit agoraphobic, having a hard time leaving the house. And because they're not facing that daily exposure of doing something hard and being resilient, they wind up having a harder time doing other things as well. And so you might see them having a hard time going to restaurants or ordering, or they might have a harder time going out in public or going to the grocery store or doing a social activity with their friends outside of school. So not all of you will see that, but that is the cautionary tale around having them go online because of an anxiety or OCD issue. That is not a school issue. It was showing up at school, that it's a slippery slope. And sometimes you have to do it anyway, because the acuity of the anxiety and OCD and their mental health deserves that. It's too much. If they're suicidal, if they're overwhelmed, if they feel like life is not worth living, if they're surviving school barely, they're white knuckling it and they barely make it through the day, and they come home and they're collapsing and they're overwhelmed, and you don't see a light at the end of the tunnel, and this has been going on for a long, long time, you might say, you know what, this just isn't working right now. And that is okay. That's a scary thing to do. And I think you have to do it with your eyes open, knowing that it can make things worse long term, but in the short term, you may not have a choice. And so everybody's situation is different. I know for us, we were dealing with bullying, which was an objective issue with the school, which wasn't going to get better. And I had tried to talk to the school. It wasn't going to get better. And it was pervasive. So it wasn't just one particular class. And so that was really impacting self-esteem. It was increasing social anxiety. So that was a huge problem. But I knew that going into an online program was going to be very cozy and comfortable. And my eyes were wide open, knowing that this was going to make the problem worse long-term for his social anxiety and even his RFID, his restrictive food intake disorder. And so, and that is what happened. It did make it worse. You know, he's living in a very cocoon, comfortable bubble right now. And so when you're doing those things, you have to put things in place as far as, one, acknowledging that it's going to get worse, but it may be worth it in the short term. Two, giving them exposure challenges outside of the environment. We're going to talk about doing that even if your child's at school. But I had to create, purposeful outings and find peer interactions and peer groups to continue to work on the social anxiety aspect of the struggles, so that we were getting some practice and there was some muscle being developed there. And that's hard. That takes more intention, because the burden rests on you as a parent. Like, I have to constantly, and it's very exhausting on top of it, because you're battling, we have to go out today. We have to do these things. If you do have your child, pulled and go to an online or a homeschooling environment, just be aware that the work and the burden will be much harder on you, and that you'll have to get them out of the house and exposed to these things in other environments outside of school. I still feel like it was a good choice for us, because he's thriving academically. He was already, but he's getting straight A's, and I feel like he's learning more because he has ADHD as well. And so I felt like he just wasn't getting a good quality education. He's going to like a university online, so he's much more challenged. And so I do feel like he's definitely getting a better education, but his social interactions and his social anxiety are separate from his academics. So one is not impacting the other as much. Sometimes online it does happen, like teacher calls on him without asking. This is happening a lot this semester, and that's overwhelming him. But, some grit and some resilience is good, even though I did say, do you want me to email her? Because she's just randomly calling on him, and you have to speak Spanish, and that's overwhelming for any kid. And then she kept calling on him. And I remember when I had social anxiety and teachers could see that you're uncomfortable and they keep calling on you. I'm like, why? Why would you do that? But he's like, no, do not email her. So I'm like, okay, well, that's good, right? That's the grit and the resilience that we want to see. But you do have to be aware that you have to kind of create that situation for them by going outside of the home and exposing them to whatever thing they were having a hard time with at school. You have to find something that can mimic that or emulate that in another environment. When we're working on this, when we're trying to get them to school in general, we'll go back and talk about that. You want manageable goals. So where are they currently, and where do you want to get them one step at a time? So if they're currently only in their bed, then my goal is for them to get dressed. If they're only in their room, my goal is for them to come out into the kitchen. That's my goal. My goal is not school if they're living in their bedroom. If they are only able to handle an hour of school, then the goal is you're just going to go to school for an hour. When we know historically they have not stayed at school longer than an hour, but the goal every day is you're going to go to school all day, then every day they feel like a failure. And really, we want to shift that perception that they're winning, they're doing a hard thing, and they're meeting their goal. And so that might mean, you know what? You're going to go to school for an hour. I want to get them back home before they feel the failure. Now you're going to go to school for 2 hours. And we're going to do that for a while, then 3 hours. Some schools won't work with you on this though, and that does suck because then you have no choice. And so our hands are tied for a lot of things. But in a perfect world, that's kind of what we'd want to do, is one small step at a time, building it up, develop their coping mechanisms for whatever that may be. A lot of times it's practicing whatever they're worried about outside of the school environment, because then you're not dealing with multiple factors and the multiple elements of school. You're only dealing with their anxiety or OCD. So if they have social anxiety, maybe you're setting up exposure challenges for them for their social anxiety outside of school. You can join a class, like outschool.com has tons of online Zoom classes for kids. I used that as an exposure with my kids a while ago, where you could sign them up for like 1 or 2 classes on any topic. They're into Minecraft, sign them up for that. They're into, I don't know, whatever, art. They're into talking about whatever. There's literally a class for everything. So they're not like boring classes. They do have those too. But that was a great way for my kids to practice social anxiety because there was no skin in the game. They didn't know these kids. It was only maybe a 1 or 2 time investment, and it was cheap. And so that would be a great way to expose them to learning how to handle discomfort around peers. If they have perfectionism, maybe you do exposures around the house of them being imperfect or doing things less than perfect, or they purposely sabotage a homework assignment, like they're doing exposures to address that. If they have separation anxiety, if your child can't even sleep alone or go to a friend's house alone, school's going to be a really big leap unless there's like a mom part 2 there, which sometimes does happen, or mom literally is there. I see that a lot where mom volunteers there. But then we want to work on separation anxiety in the house. Can you separate in the house? Can you go to, somewhere else while your child is home with another parent or relative? Building up their tolerance for separation anxiety in environments that they're not comfortable in. Because sometimes parents will come back and say, oh no, they'll go to my particular friend's house, or they'll go to their grandma's house, not places they're comfortable at. That's how you don't build muscle when you're going to places that are easy. Emetophobia, definitely, obviously therapy for all of these things do help. Emetophobia, you're going to be doing hierarchies on exposing yourself to images of throw up, videos of throw up, and then maybe you go to places where it's a little overwhelming. I've done exposures where I've gone to CVS and I've had kids sit in the seats where they have like their Medi-clinic, like they're like little, like, I don't know what you call them, like Medi-clinic. It's like a little medicine clinic, but people go there. You can go there if you're not feeling well. And so that was like a very high level exposure to walk by that area. Like this is where people go when they're feeling sick. But you're not going to start there. So start baby steps. But working on emetophobia outside of school is a huge thing. If you're dealing with moral OCD, then you're doing exposures around moral OCD, hearing bad words and seeing things that trigger the moral OCD. Help them learn how to handle the discomfort those bring. If you're dealing with contamination OCD, then you're going to be dealing with doing exposures around the contamination. If it's school objects that are contaminated, then you're going to slowly integrate those objects into your home and your world. And I have done YouTube videos on this and podcasts on this. And so my How to Teach Kids to Crush OCD course walks you through how to do all this. But you're going to slowly and systematically teach them how to expose themselves to their ground zero, the thing that is causing the contamination, and build that muscle over time. So we definitely want to work on those issues outside of school, teach them coping mechanisms on how to handle these things when they happen. Brainstorm when you go to school and this happens. What's the worst thing that can happen at school? What's the worst thing that has happened that scares you? And then you brainstorm and problem solve. If that happens, here's the plan of what you can do moving forward. And the last thing, not the first thing, is you add the cherry on top, which is then you incentivize them. I'm going to give you bravery points for going to school, You're going to go to school for an hour. You're going to earn X, Y, and Z bravery points that can turn into this prize or this goal. When my kids were younger, I would make a menu of things with different bravery point costs. And so there were things that were really inexpensive and there were things that were bigger. And that way they could choose, I want to cash in my bravery points or not. Now that they're older, they just want money. So bravery points equal $1. So I'll say you can get 5 points, but really what I'm saying is you can get $5. They're older now, 13 and 15. They want money. But that does add the cherry on top of saying, I recognize that this is hard for you. And if you are able to do it, then you can earn X, Y, and Z points. And when they're manageable goals, if I want you to go to school for 2 hours or 3 hours, if I want you to get up and get dressed and just go to the kitchen for 5 minutes, whatever and wherever they are, it's more achievable and they start to feel empowered. Like I'm doing something. I feel success today. I met that goal that my parents want me to do. And so that improves self-esteem, it improves motivation, it improves resilience, and it improves the likelihood that they're going to want to go on to the next goal. Because nobody wants to be like this. Nobody wants to feel overwhelmed, shut down, and not able to go to school. Even if they don't like school, nobody wants to be unable to function. And so deep down, every kid wants to be able to do the things that they're supposed to do. It doesn't feel good for anybody. And so if we can set it up where they can feel some success, the better they'll do. And lastly, I just want to mention that this is hard. This is hard because you only are one piece of the puzzle. And if your child's foot is on the brake, there's only so much you can do. All the things that I talked about today, that's all you can do. They may not be willing to do exposures. They may not be willing to get out of their bed. They may not be willing to stay past an hour forever. Those are things that are really hard because they are out of our control. That's why therapy and a lot of times medication is a really important component of this because it is a physiological disorder, both of them. And need for therapy and medication is really important, especially when you're dealing with ongoing long-term school avoidance. Then you want to have a discussion about what therapeutic interventions can we have. And again, even that's not in your control because your child can refuse therapy and refuse medication and your hands are tied again. So all that to say, I get it. I've been there and I understand the struggle. And I hope that some of the things that I talked about today at least give you a little bit of a guidance and foundation of the things that you can do to hopefully make it better. And I hope that you find the sparkle in everything you do. And I'll talk to you again next Tuesday. Take care.
Thank you for listening to the AT Parenting Survival Podcast. To get additional support raising a child with anxiety or OCD, visit Natasha's online school of on-demand classes at atparentingsurvivalschool.com.